Chapter 7. How Mr. Winkle, instead of shooting at the pigeon and killing the crow, shot at the crow and wounded the pigeon. How the Dingley-Dell Cricket Club played All Muggleton, and how All Muggleton dined at the Dingley-Dell expense, with other interesting and instructive matters. The fatiguing adventures of the day or the somniferous influence of the clergyman's tale operated so strongly on the drowsy tendencies of Mr. Pickwick that, in less than 5 minutes after he had been shown to his comfortable bedroom, he fell into a sound and dreamless sleep, from which he was only awakened by the morning sun darting his bright beams reproachfully into the apartment. Mr. Pickwick was no sluggard, and he sprang like an ardent warrior from his tent bedstead. "Pleasant, pleasant country," sighed the enthusiastic gentleman, as he opened his latticed window. "Who could live to gaze from day to day on bricks and slates, who had once felt the influence of a scene like this? Who could continue to exist, where there are no cows but the cows on the chimney-pots, nothing redolent of pan but pan-tiles, no crop but stone-crop? Who could bear to drag out a life in such a spot? Who, I ask, could endure it?" And, having cross-examined solitude after the most approved precedents, at considerable length, Mr. Pickwick thrust his head out of the lattice and looked around him. The rich, sweet smell of the hayricks rose to his chamber window. The 100 perfumes of the little flower garden beneath scented the air around. The deep green meadows shone in the morning dew that glistened on every leaf as it trembled in the gentle air, and the birds sang as if every sparkling drop were to them a fountain of inspiration. Mr. Pickwick fell into an enchanting and delicious reverie. "Hullo!" was the sound that roused him. He looked to the right, but he saw nobody. His eyes wandered to the left and pierced the prospect. He stared into the sky, but he wasn't wanted there. And then he did what a common mind would have done at once, looked into the garden, and there saw Mr. Wardle. "How are you?" said that good-humored individual, out of breath with his own anticipations of pleasure. "Beautiful morning, ain't it? Glad to see you up so early. Make haste down, and I'll come out. I'll wait for you here." Mr. Pickwick needed no second invitation. 10 minutes sufficed for the completion of his toilet. And at the expiration of that time, he was by the old gentleman's side. "Hello," said Mr. Pickwick in his turn, seeing that his companion was armed with a gun, and that another lay ready on the grass. "What's going forward?" "Why, your friend and I," replied the host, "are going out rook-shooting before breakfast. He's a very good shot, ain't he?" "I've heard him say he's a capital one," replied Mr. Pickwick, "but I never saw him aim at anything." "Well," said the host, "I wish you'd got him. Joe! Joe!" The fat boy, who, under the exciting influence of the morning, did not appear to be more than 3 parts and a fraction asleep, emerged from the house. "Go up and call the gentleman, and tell him he'll find me and Mr. Pickwick in the rookery. Show the gentleman the way here, do you hear?" The boy departed to execute his commission, and the host, carrying both guns like a second Robinson Crusoe, led the way from the garden. "This is the place," said the old gentleman, pausing after a few minutes' walking in an avenue of trees. The information was unnecessary, for the incessant cawing of the unconscious rooks sufficiently indicated their whereabout. The old gentleman laid one gun on the ground and loaded the other. "Here they are," said Mr. Pickwick, and as he spoke, the forms of Mr. Tupman, Mr. Snodgrass, and Mr. Winkle appeared in the distance. The fat boy, not being quite certain which gentleman he was directed to call, had, with peculiar sagacity, and to prevent the possibility of any mistake, called them all. "Come along," shouted the old gentleman, addressing Mr. Winkle. "A keen hand like you ought to have been up long ago, even to such poor work as this." Mr. Winkle responded with a forced smile, and took up the spare gun with an expression of countenance which a metaphysical rook, impressed with the foreboding of his approaching death by violence, may be supposed to assume. It might have been his keenness, but it looked remarkably like misery. The old gentleman nodded, and 2 ragged boys, who had been marshalled to the spot under the direction of the infant Lambert, forthwith commenced climbing up 2 of the trees. "What are those lads for?" inquired Mr. Pickwick abruptly. He was rather alarmed, for he was not quite certain but that the distress of the agricultural interest, about which he had often heard a great deal, might have compelled the small boys, attached to the soil, to earn a precarious and hazardous subsistence by making marks of themselves for inexperienced sportsmen. "Only to start the game," replied Mr. Wardle, laughing. "To what?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Why, in plain English, to frighten the rooks." "Oh, is that all?" "You are satisfied?" "Quite." "Very well. Shall I begin?" "If you please," said Mr. Winkle, glad of any respite. "Stand aside, then. Now for it." The boy shouted, and shook a branch with a nest on it. Half a dozen young rooks in violent conversation flew out to ask what the matter was. The old gentleman fired by way of reply. Down fell one bird, and off flew the others. "Take him up, Joe," said the old gentleman. There was a smile upon the youth's face as he advanced. Indistinct visions of rook pie floated through his imagination. He laughed as he retired with the bird. It was a plump one. "Now, Mr. Winkle," said the host, reloading his own gun. "Fire away." Mr. Winkle advanced and leveled his gun. Mr. Pickwick and his friends cowered involuntarily to escape damage from the heavy fall of rooks, which they felt quite certain would be occasioned by the devastating barrel of their friend. There was a solemn pause, a shout, a flapping of wings, a faint click. "Hello," said the old gentleman. "Won't it go?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Missed fire," said Mr. Winkle, who was very pale, probably from disappointment. "Odd," said the old gentleman, taking the gun. "Never knew one of them miss fire before. Why, I don't see anything of the cap." "Bless my soul," said Mr. Winkle. "I declare I forgot the cap." The slight omission was rectified. Mr. Pickwick crouched again. Mr. Winkle stepped forward with an air of determination and resolution, and Mr. Tupman looked out from behind a tree. The boy shouted. 4 birds flew out. Mr. Winkle fired. There was a scream as of an individual, not a rook, in corporeal anguish. Mr. Tupman had saved the lives of innumerable offending birds by receiving a portion of the charge in his left arm. To describe the confusion that ensued would be impossible. To tell how Mr. Pickwick, in the first transports of his emotion, called Mr. Winkle "wretch," how Mr. Tupman lay prostrate on the ground, and how Mr. Winkle knelt horror-stricken beside him, how Mr. Tupman called distractedly upon some feminine Christian name, and then opened first one eye, and then the other, and then fell back and shut them both. All this would be as difficult to describe in detail as it would be to depict the gradual recovering of the unfortunate individual, the binding up his arm with pocket handkerchiefs, and the conveying him back by slow degrees, supported by the arms of his anxious friends. They drew near the house. The ladies were at the garden gate, waiting for their arrival and their breakfast. The spinster aunt appeared. She smiled and beckoned them to walk quicker. 'Twas evident she knew not of the disaster. Poor thing. There are times when ignorance is bliss indeed. They approached nearer. "Why, what is the matter with the little old gentleman?" said Isabella Wardle. The spinster aunt heeded not the remark. She thought it applied to Mr. Pickwick. In her eyes, Tracy Tupman was a youth. She viewed his years through a diminishing glass. "Don't be frightened," called out the old host, fearful of alarming his daughters. The little party had crowded so completely around Mr. Tupman that they could not yet clearly discern the nature of the accident. "Don't be frightened," said the host. "What's the matter?" screamed the ladies. "Mr. Tupman has met with a little accident, that's all." The spinster aunt uttered a piercing scream, burst into a hysteric laugh, and fell backwards in the arms of her nieces. "Throw some cold water over her," said the old gentleman. "No, no," murmured the spinster aunt. "I am better now. Bella, Emily, a surgeon. Is he wounded? Is he dead? Is he... Here the spinster aunt burst into fit number 2 of hysteric laughter, interspersed with screams. "Calm yourself," said Mr. Tupman, affected almost to tears by this expression of sympathy with his sufferings. "Dear, dear madam, calm yourself." "It is his voice!" exclaimed the spinster aunt, and strong symptoms of fit number 3 developed themselves forthwith. "Do not agitate yourself, I entreat you, dearest madam," said Mr. Tupman soothingly. "I am very little hurt, I assure you." "Then you are not dead!" ejaculated the hysterical lady. "Oh, say you are not dead!" "Don't be a fool, Rachel," interposed Mr. Wardle, rather more roughly than was quite consistent with the poetic nature of the scene. "What the devil's the use of his saying he isn't dead?" "No, no, I am not," said Mr. Tupman. "I require no assistance but yours. Let me lean on your arm," he added in a whisper. "Oh, Miss Rachel." The agitated female advanced and offered her arm. They turned into the breakfast parlor. Mr. Tracy Tupman gently pressed her hand to his lips and sank upon the sofa. "Are you faint?" inquired the anxious Rachel. "No," said Mr. Tupman. "It is nothing. I shall be better presently." He closed his eyes. "He sleeps," murmured the spinster aunt. His organs of vision had been closed nearly 20 seconds. Dear Mr. Tupman." Mr. Tupman jumped up. "Oh, say those words again," he exclaimed. The lady started. "Surely you did not hear them," she said bashfully. "Oh, yes, I did," replied Mr. Tupman. "Repeat them. If you would have me recover, repeat them." "Hush," said the lady. "My brother." Mr. Tracy Tupman resumed his former position, and Mr. Wardle, accompanied by a surgeon, entered the room. The arm was examined, the wound dressed, and pronounced to be a very slight one, and the minds of the company having been thusly satisfied, they proceeded to satisfy their appetites with countenances to which an expression of cheerfulness was again restored. Mr. Pickwick alone was silent and reserved. Doubt and distrust were exhibited in his countenance. His confidence in Mr. Winkle had been shaken, greatly shaken, by the proceedings of the morning. "Are you a cricketer?" inquired Mr. Wardle of the marksman. At any other time, Mr. Winkle would have replied in the affirmative. He felt the delicacy of his situation, and modestly replied, "No." "Are you, sir?" inquired Mr. Snodgrass. "I was once upon a time," replied the host, "but I have given it up now. I subscribe to the club here, but I don't play." "The grand match is played today, I believe," said Mr. Pickwick. "It is," replied the host. "Of course you would like to see it." "I, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick, "am delighted to view any sport which may be safely indulged in, and in which the impotent effects of unskilful people do not endanger human life." Mr. Pickwick paused and looked steadily on Mr. Winkle, who quailed beneath his leader's searching glance. The great man withdrew his eyes after a few minutes, and added, "Shall we be justified in leaving our wounded friend to the care of the ladies?" "You cannot leave me in better hands," said Mr. Tupman. "Quite impossible," said Mr. Snodgrass. It was therefore settled that Mr. Tupman should be left at home in charge of the females, and that the remainder of the guests, under the guidance of Mr. Wardle, should proceed to the spot where was to be held that trial of skill which had roused all Muggleton from its torpor, and inoculated Dingley Dell with a fever of excitement. As their walk, which was not above 2 miles long, lay through shady lanes and sequestered footpaths, and as their conversation turned upon the delightful scenery by which they were on every side surrounded, Mr. Pickwick was almost inclined to regret the expedition they had used, when he found himself in the main street of the town of Muggleton. Everybody whose genius has a topographical bent knows perfectly well that Muggleton is a corporate town, with a mayor, burgesses, and freemen. And everybody who has consulted the addresses of the mayor to the freemen, or the freemen to the mayor, or both to the corporation, or all three to Parliament, will learn from thence what they ought to have known before, that Muggleton is an ancient and loyal borough, mingling a zealous advocacy of Christian principles with a devoted attachment to commercial rights, in demonstration whereof the mayor, corporation, and other inhabitants have presented at diverse times no fewer than 1,420 petitions against the continuance of Negro slavery abroad, and an equal number against any interference with the factory system at home, 68 for permitting the sale of benefices in the church, and 86 for abolishing Sunday trading in the streets. Mr. Pickwick stood in the principal street of this illustrious town, and gazed with an air of curiosity not unmixed with interest on the objects around him. There was an open square for the marketplace, and in the center of it a large inn with a signpost in front, displaying an object very common in art, but rarely met with in nature, to wit, a blue lion with 3 bow legs in the air, balancing himself on the extreme point of the center claw of his 4th foot. There were, within sight, an auctioneer's and fire agency office, a corn factor's, a linen draper's, a saddler's, a distiller's, a grocer's, and a shoe shop, the last mentioned warehouse being also appropriated to the diffusion of hats, bonnets, wearing apparel, cotton umbrellas, and useful knowledge. There was a red brick house with a small paved courtyard in front, which anybody might have known belonged to the attorney. And there was, moreover, another red brick house with Venetian blinds and a large brass door plate with a very legible announcement that it belonged to the surgeon. A few boys were making their way to the cricket field, and 2 or 3 shopkeepers who were standing at their doors looked as if they should like to be making their way to the same spot, as indeed to all appearance they might have done, without losing any great amount of custom thereby. Mr. Pickwick, having paused to make these observations, to be noted down at a more convenient period, hastened to rejoin his friends, who had turned out of the main street, and were already within sight of the field of battle. The wickets were pitched, and so were a couple of marquees for the rest and refreshment of the contending parties. The game had not yet commenced. 2 or 3 Dingley-Dellers and all Muggletonians were amusing themselves with a majestic air by throwing the ball carelessly from hand to hand, and several other gentlemen, dressed like them in straw hats, flannel jackets, and white trousers, a costume in which they looked very much like amateur stonemasons, were sprinkled about the tents, towards one of which Mr. Wardle conducted the party. Several dozen of "How are yous?" hailed the old gentleman's arrival, and a general raising of the straw hats and bending forward of the flannel jackets followed his introduction of his guests as gentlemen from London, who were extremely anxious to witness the proceedings of the day, with which, he had no doubt, they would be greatly delighted. "You had better step into the marquee, I think, sir," said one of the very stout gentlemen, whose body and legs looked like half a gigantic roll of flannel, elevated on a couple of inflated pillowcases. "You find it much pleasanter, sir," urged another stout gentleman, who strongly resembled the other half of the roll of flannel aforesaid. "You're very good," said Mr. Pickwick. "This way," said the first speaker. "They notch in here. It's the best place in the whole field." And the cricketer, panting on before, preceded them to the tent. "Capital game, smart sport, fine exercise, very," were the words which fell upon Mr. Pickwick's ear as he entered the tent, and the first object that met his eyes was his green-coated friend of the Rochester coach, holding forth, to the no small delight and edification of a select circle of the chosen All-Muggleton. His dress was slightly improved, and he wore boots, but there was no mistaking him. The stranger recognized his friends immediately, and, darting forward and seizing Mr. Pickwick by the hand, dragged him to a seat with his usual impetuosity, talking all the while as if the whole of the arrangements were under his especial patronage and direction. This way, capital fun, lots of beer, hogshead, rounds of beef, bollocks, mustard, cartloads, glorious day, down with you, make yourself at home, glad to see you, very." Mr. Pickwick sat down as he was bid, and Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass also complied with the directions of their mysterious friend. Mr. Wardle looked on in silent wonder. "Mr. Wardle, a friend of mine," said Mr. Pickwick. "Friend of yours? My dear sir, how are you? Friend of my friends. Give me your hand, sir." And the stranger grasped Mr. Wardle's hands with all the fervor of a close intimacy of many years, and then stepped back a pace or two, as if to take a full survey of his face and figure, and then shook hands with him again, if possible, more warmly than before. "Well, and how came you here?" said Mr. Pickwick, with a smile in which benevolence struggled with surprise. "Come," replied the stranger, "stopping at Crown at Muggleton, better party, flannel jackets, white trousers, anchovy sandwiches, deviled kidneys, splendid fellows, glorious." Mr. Pickwick was sufficiently versed in the stranger's system of stenography to infer from this rapid and disjointed communication that he had, somehow or other, contracted an acquaintance with the All-Muggletons, which he had converted, by a process peculiar to himself, into that extent of good fellowship on which a general invitation may be easily founded. His curiosity was therefore satisfied, and putting on his spectacles, he prepared himself to watch the play which was just commencing. All-Muggleton had the first innings, and the interest became intense when Mr. Dumbkins and Mr. Potter, 2 of the most renowned members of that most distinguished club, walked, bat in hand, to their respective wickets. Mr. Luffy, the highest ornament of Dingley Dell, was pitched to bowl against the redoubtable Dumbkins, and Mr. Struggles was selected to do the same kind office for the hitherto unconquered Potter. Several players were stationed to look out in different parts of the field, and each fixed himself onto the proper attitude by placing one hand on each knee and stooping very much as if he were making a back for some beginner at leapfrog. all the regular players do this sort of thing. Indeed, it's generally supposed that it is quite impossible to look out properly in any other position. The umpires were stationed behind the wickets. The scorers were prepared to notch the runs. A breathless silence ensued. Mr. Luffy retired a few paces behind the wicket of the passive Potter, and applied the ball to his right eye for several seconds. Dumbkins confidently awaited its coming, with his eyes fixed on the motions of Luffy. "Play!" suddenly cried the bowler. The ball flew from his hand straight and swift towards the center stump of the wicket. The wary Dumbkins was on the alert. It fell upon the tip of the bat, and bounded far away over the heads of the scouts, who had just stooped low enough to let it fly over them. "Run! Run! Another! Now then, throw her up! Up with her! Stop there! Another! No! Yes! No! Throw her up! Throw her up!" Such were the shouts which followed the stroke, and at the conclusion of which all Muggleton had scored 2. Nor was Potter behindhand in earning laurels wherewith to garnish himself and Muggleton. He blocked the doubtful balls, missed the bad ones, took the good ones, and sent them flying to all parts of the field. The scouts were hot and tired. The bowlers were charged and bowled till their arms ached, but Dumbkins and Potter remained unconquered. Did an elderly gentleman essay to stop the progress of the ball, it rolled between his legs or slipped between his fingers. Did a slim gentleman try to catch it, it struck him on the nose, and bounded pleasantly off with redoubled violence, while the slim gentleman's eyes filled with water, and his form writhed with anguish. Was it thrown straight up to the wicket? Dumbkins had reached it before the ball. In short, when Dumbkins was caught out, and Potter stumped out, all Muggleton had notched some 54, while the score of the Dingley Dellers was as blank as their faces. The advantage was too great to be recovered. In vain did the eager Luffy and the enthusiastic Struggles do all that skill and experience could suggest to regain the ground Dingley Dell had lost in the contest. It was of no avail, and in an early period of the winning game, Dingley Dell gave in and allowed the superior prowess of all Muggleton. The stranger, meanwhile, had been eating, drinking, and talking without cessation. At every good stroke, he expressed his satisfaction and approval of the player in a most condescending and patronizing manner, which could not fail to have been highly gratifying to the party concerned, while at every bad attempt at a catch, and every failure to stop the ball, he launched his personal displeasure at the head of the devoted individual in such denunciations as, "Aha! Stupid! Now, Butterfingers! Muff! Humbug!" and so forth. Ejaculations which seemed to establish him in the opinion of all around as a most excellent and undeniable judge of the whole art and mystery of the noble game of cricket. "Capital game! Well played! Some strokes admirable!" said the stranger as both sides crowded into the tent at the conclusion of the game. "You've played it, sir?" inquired Mr. Wardle, who had been much amused by his loquacity. "Played it? Think I have. Thousands of times. Not here. West Indies. Exciting thing. Hot work. Very." "It must be a rather warm pursuit in such a climate," observed Mr. Pickwick. "Warm, red hot, scorching, glowing. Played a match once. Single wicket. Friend the Colonel, Sir Thomas Blazo. Who should get the greatest number of runs? Won the toss. First innings, 7 o'clock a.m. 6 natives to look out. Went in, kept in. Heat intense. Natives all fainted. Taken away. Fresh half dozen ordered. Fainted also. Blazo bowling. Supported by 2 natives. Couldn't bowl me out. Fainted too. Cleared away the Colonel. Wouldn't give in. Faithful attendant, Quanko Samba. Last man left. Sun so hot, bat in blisters. Bat scorched brown. 527 runs. Rather exhausted. Quanko mustered up last remaining strength, bowled me out, had a bath, and went out to dinner." "And what became of what's-his-name, sir?" inquired an old gentleman. "Blazo? No, the other gentleman. Quanko Samba? Yes, sir. Poor Quanko. Never recovered it. Bowled on my account, bowled off on his own. Died, sir." Here the stranger buried his countenance in a brown jug, but whether to hide his emotion or imbibe its contents, we cannot distinctly affirm. We only know that he paused suddenly, drew a long and deep breath, and looked anxiously on, as 2 of the principal members of the Dingley Dell Club approached Mr. Pickwick and said, "We are about to partake of a plain dinner at the Blue Lion, sir. We hope you and your friends will join us." "Of course," said Mr. Wardle. "Among our friends we include Mr.—" and he looked towards the stranger. "Jingle," said that versatile gentleman, taking the hint at once. "Jingle, Alfred Jingle, Esquire, of No Hall, Nowhere." "I shall be very happy, I am sure," said Mr. Pickwick. "So shall I," said Mr. Alfred Jingle, drawing one arm through Mr. Pickwick's and another through Mr. Wardle's, as he whispered confidentially in the ear of the former gentleman. "Devilish good dinner, cold but capital. Peeped into the room this morning. Fowls and pies, and all that sort of thing. Pleasant fellows these, well behaved too, very." There being no further preliminaries to arrange, the company straggled into the town in little knots of 2s and 3s, and within a quarter of an hour were all seated in the great room of the Blue Lion in Muggleton, Mr. Dumbkins acting as chairman, and Mr. Luffy officiating as vice. There was a vast deal of talking, and rattling of knives and forks and plates, a great running about of 3 ponderous-headed waiters, and a rapid disappearance of the substantial viands on the table, to each and every of which item of confusion the facetious Mr. Jingle lent the aid of 6 ordinary men at least. When everybody had to eat as much as they could, the cloth was removed, bottles, glasses, and dessert were placed on the table, and the waiters withdrew to clear away, or in other words, to appropriate to their own private use and emolument whatever remnants of the eatables and drinkables they could contrive to lay their hands on. Amidst the general hum of mirth and conversation that ensued, there was a little man with a puffy say-nothing-to-me or I'll contradict you sort of countenance, who remained very quiet, occasionally looking round him when the conversation slackened, as if he contemplated putting in something very weighty, and now and then bursting into a short cough of inexpressible grandeur. At length, during a moment of comparative silence, the little man called out in a very loud, solemn voice, "Mr. Luffy!" Everybody was hushed into a profound stillness as the individual addressed replied, "Sir, I wish to address a few words to you, sir, if you will entreat the gentlemen to fill their glasses." Mr. Jingle uttered a patronizing "Hear, hear," which was responded to by the remainder of the company, and the glasses having been filled, the vice-president assumed an air of wisdom in a state of profound attention, and said, "Mr. Staple." "Sir," said the little man, rising, "I wish to address what I have to say to you, and not to our worthy chairman, because our worthy chairman is in some measure, I may say in a great degree, the subject of what I have to say, or I may say to state," suggested Mr. Jingle. "Yes, to state," said the little man. "I thank my honorable friend, if he will allow me to call him so," 4 hears, and 1 certainly from Mr. Jingle, "for the suggestion. Sir, I am a Deller, a Dingley Deller." Cheers. "I cannot lay claim to the honor of forming an item in the population of Muggleton, nor, sir, I will frankly admit, do I covet that honor, and I will tell you why, sir. Here, to Muggleton I will readily concede all those honors and distinctions to which it can fairly lay claim. They are too numerous and too well known to require aid or recapitulation from me. But, sir, while we remember that Muggleton has given birth to a Dumbkins and a Potter, let us never forget that Dingley Dell can boast a Luffy and a Struggles." Vociferous cheering. "Let me not be considered as wishing to detract from the merits of the former gentlemen. Sir, I envy them the luxury of their own feelings on this occasion." Cheers. Every gentleman who hears me is probably acquainted with the reply made by an individual who, to use an ordinary figure of speech, hung out in a tub to the Emperor Alexander. "If I were not Diogenes," said he, "I would be Alexander." I can well imagine these gentlemen to say, "If I were not Dumbkins, I would be Luffy. If I were not Potter, I would be Struggles." Enthusiasm. "But, gentlemen of Muggleton, is it in cricket alone that your fellow townsmen stand preeminent? Have you never heard of Dumbkins and Determination? Have you never been taught to associate Potter with property?" Great applause. "Have you never, when struggling for your rights, your liberties, and your privileges, been reduced, if only for an instant, to misgiving and despair? And when you have been thus depressed, has not the name of Dumbkins laid afresh within your breast the fire which had just gone out, and has not a word from that man lighted it again as brightly as if it had never expired?" Great cheering. "Gentlemen, I beg you to surround with a rich halo of enthusiastic cheering the united names of Dumbkins and Potter." Here the little man ceased, and here the company commenced a raising of voices and thumping of tables, which lasted with little intermission during the remainder of the evening. Other toasts were drunk. Mr. Luffy and Mr. Struggles, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Jingle were, each in his turn, the subject of unqualified eulogium, and each in due course returned thanks for the honor. Enthusiastic as we are in the noble cause to which we have devoted ourselves, we should have felt a sensation of pride which we cannot express, and a consciousness of having done something to mere immortality, of which we are now deprived, could we have laid the faintest outline of these addresses before our ardent readers. Mr. Snodgrass, as usual, took a great mass of notes, which would no doubt have afforded most useful and valuable information, had not the burning eloquence of the words or the feverish influence of the wine made that gentleman's hand so extremely unsteady as to render his writing nearly unintelligible, and his style wholly so. By dint of patient investigation, we have been enabled to trace some characters bearing a faint resemblance to the names of the speakers, and we can also discern an entry of a song supposed to have been sung by Mr. Jingle, in which the words bowl, sparkling, ruby, bright, and wine are frequently repeated at short intervals. We fancy, too, that we can discern at the very end of the notes some indistinct reference to broiled bones, and then the words cold without occur. But as any hypothesis we could found upon them must necessarily rest upon mere conjecture, we are not disposed to indulge in any of the speculations to which they may give rise. We will therefore return to Mr. Tupman, merely adding that within some few minutes before 12 o'clock that night, the convocation of worthies of Dingley Dell and Muggleton were heard to sing with great feeling and emphasis the beautiful and pathetic national air of "We won't go home till morning, we won't go home till morning, we won't go home till morning, till daylight doth appear." Chapter 8. Strongly illustrative of the position that the course of true love is not a railway. The quiet seclusion of Dingley Dell, the presence of so many of the gentler sex, and the solicitude and anxiety they evinced in his behalf, were all favorable to the growth and development of those softer feelings which nature had implanted deep in the bosom of Mr. Tracy Tupman, and which now appeared destined to center in one lovely object. The young ladies were pretty, their manners winning, their dispositions unexceptionable. But there was a dignity in the air, a touch-me-not-ishness in the walk, a majesty in the eye of the spinster aunt, to which, at their time of life, they could lay no claim, which distinguished her from any female on whom Mr. Tupman had ever gazed. That there was something kindred in their nature, something congenial in their souls, something mysteriously sympathetic in their bosoms, was evident. Her name was the first that rose to Mr. Tupman's lips as he lay wounded on the grass, and her hysteric laughter was the first sound that fell upon his ear when he was supported to the house. But had her agitation arisen from an amiable and feminine sensibility which would have been equally irrepressible in any case, or had it been called forth by a more ardent and passionate feeling which he, of all men living, could alone awaken? These were the doubts which racked his brain as he lay extended on the sofa. These were the doubts which he determined should be at once and forever resolved. It was evening. Isabella and Emily had strolled out with Mr. Trundle. The deaf old lady had fallen asleep in her chair, and the snoring of the fat boy penetrated in a low and monotonous sound from the distant kitchen. The buxom servants were lounging at the side door, enjoying the pleasantness of the hour, and the delights of a flirtation, on first principles, with certain unwieldy animals attached to the farm. And there sat the interesting pair, uncared for by all, caring for none, and dreaming only of themselves. There they sat, in short, like a pair of carefully folded kid gloves, bound up in each other. "I have forgotten my flowers," said the spinster aunt. "What of them now?" said Mr. Tupman, in accents of persuasion. "You will take cold in the evening air," urged the spinster aunt affectionately. "No, no," said Mr. Tupman, rising. "It will do me good. Let me accompany you." The lady paused to adjust the sling in which the left arm of the youth was placed, and taking his right arm, led him to the garden. There was a bower at the further end, with honeysuckle, jessamine, and creeping plants, one of those sweet retreats which humane men erect for the accommodation of spiders. The spinster aunt took up a large watering pot which lay in one corner, and was about to leave the arbor. Mr. Tupman detained her, and drew her to a seat beside him. "Miss Wardle," said he. The spinster aunt trembled, till some pebbles which had accidentally found their way into the large watering pot shook like an infant's rattle. "Miss Wardle," said Mr. Tupman, "you are an angel." "Mr. Tupman!" exclaimed Rachel, blushing as red as the watering pot itself. "Nay," said the eloquent Pickwickian, "I know it but too well." "All women are angels, they say," murmured the lady playfully. "Then what can you be? Or to what, without presumption, can I compare you?" replied Mr. Tupman. "Where was the woman ever seen who resembled you? Where else could I hope to find so rare a combination of excellence and beauty? Where else could I seek to... Oh!" Here Mr. Tupman paused, and pressed the hand which clasped the handle of the happy watering pot. The lady turned aside her head. "Men are such deceivers," she softly whispered. They are," ejaculated Mr. Tupman. "But not all men. There lives at least one being who can never change. One being who would be content to devote his whole existence to your happiness, who lives but in your eyes, who breathes but in your smiles, who bears the heavy burden of life itself only for you. Could such an individual be found?" said the lady. "But he can be found," said the ardent Mr. Tupman, interposing. "He is found. He is here, Miss Wardle." And ere the lady was aware of his intention, Mr. Tupman had sunk upon his knees at her feet. "Mr. Tupman, rise," said Rachel. "Never," was the valorous reply. "Oh, Rachel!" He seized her passive hand, and the watering pot fell to the ground as he pressed it to his lips. "Oh, Rachel, say you love me." "Mr. Tupman," said the spinster aunt, with averted head, "I can hardly speak the words, but you are not wholly indifferent to me." Mr. Tupman no sooner heard this avowal than he proceeded to do what his enthusiastic emotions prompted, and what, for aught we know, for we are but little acquainted with such matters, people so circumstanced always do. He jumped up, and throwing his arm round the neck of the spinster aunt, imprinted upon her lips numerous kisses, which, after a due show of struggling and resistance, she received so passively that there was no telling how many more Mr. Tupman might have bestowed, if the lady had not given a very unaffected start, and exclaimed in an affrighted tone, "Mr. Tupman, we are observed! We are discovered!" Mr. Tupman looked round. There was the fat boy, perfectly motionless, with his large circular eyes staring into the arbor, but without the slightest expression on his face that the most expert physiognomist could have referred to astonishment, curiosity, or any other known passion that agitates the human breast. Mr. Tupman gazed on the fat boy, and the fat boy stared at him. And the longer Mr. Tupman observed the utter vacancy of the fat boy's countenance, the more convinced he became that he either did not know, or did not understand, anything that had been going forward. Under this impression, he said with great firmness, "What do you want here, sir?" "Supper's ready, sir," was the prompt reply. "Have you just come here, sir?" inquired Mr. Tupman, with a piercing look. "Just," replied the fat boy. Mr. Tupman looked at him very hard again, but there was not a wink in his eye or a curve in his face. Mr. Tupman took the arm of the spinster aunt and walked towards the house. The fat boy followed behind. "He knows nothing of what has happened," he whispered. "Nothing," said the spinster aunt. There was a sound behind them, as of an imperfectly suppressed chuckle. Mr. Tupman turned sharply round. No, it could not have been the fat boy. There was not a gleam of mirth, or anything but feeding, in his whole visage. "He must have been fast asleep," whispered Mr. Tupman. "I have not the least doubt of it," replied the spinster aunt. They both laughed heartily. Mr. Tupman was wrong. The fat boy, for once, had not been fast asleep. He was awake, wide awake, to what had been going forward. The supper passed off without any attempt at a general conversation. The old lady had gone to bed. Isabella Wardle devoted herself exclusively to Mr. Trundle. The spinster aunt's attentions were reserved for Mr. Tupman, and Emily's thoughts appeared to be engrossed by some distant object. Possibly they were with the absent Snodgrass. 11, 12, 1 o'clock had struck, and the gentleman had not arrived. Consternation sat on every face. Could they have been waylaid and robbed? Should they send men and lanterns in every direction by which they could be supposed likely to have traveled home? Or should they— Hark! Here they were! What could have made them so late? A strange voice, too. To whom could it belong? They rushed into the kitchen whither the truants had repaired, and at once obtained rather more than a glimmering of the real state of the case. Mr. Pickwick, with his hands in his pockets, and his hat cocked completely over his left eye, was leaning against the dresser, shaking his head from side to side, and producing a constant succession of the blandest and most benevolent smiles, without being moved thereunto by any discernible cause or pretense whatsoever. Old Mr. Wardle, with a highly inflamed countenance, was grasping the hand of a strange gentleman, muttering protestations of eternal friendship. Mr. Winkle, supporting himself by the 8-day clock, was feebly invoking destruction upon the head of any member of the family who should suggest the propriety of his retiring for the night. And Mr. Snodgrass had sunk into a chair with an expression of the most abject and hopeless misery that the human mind can imagine, portrayed in every lineament of his expressive face. "Is anything the matter?" inquired the three ladies. "Nothing the matter," replied Mr. Pickwick. We're all right. I say, Wardle, we're all right, ain't we?" "I should think so," replied the jolly host. "My dears, here's my friend Mr. Jingle, Mr. Pickwick's friend Mr. Jingle, come upon little visit." "Is anything the matter with Mr. Snodgrass, sir?" inquired Emily, with great anxiety. "Nothing the matter, ma'am," replied the stranger. "Cricket dinner, glorious party, capital songs, old port, claret, good, very good, wine, ma'am, wine." "It wasn't the wine," murmured Mr. Snodgrass in a broken voice. "It was the salmon. Somehow or other, it never is the wine in these cases." "Hadn't they better go to bed, ma'am?" inquired Emma. "Two of the boys will carry the gentleman upstairs." "I won't go to bed," said Mr. Winkle firmly. "No living boy shall carry me," said Mr. Pickwick stoutly, and he went on smiling as before. "Hurrah!" gasped Mr. Winkle faintly. "Hurrah!" echoed Mr. Pickwick, taking off his hat and dashing it on the floor, and insanely casting his spectacles into the middle of the kitchen. At this humorous feat, he laughed outright. "Let's have another bottle," cried Mr. Winkle, commencing in a very loud key, and ending in a very faint one. His head dropped upon his breast, and, muttering his invincible determination not to go to his bed, and a sanguinary regret that he had not done for old Tupman in the morning, he fell fast asleep, in which condition he was borne to his apartment by two young giants under the personal superintendence of the fat boy, to whose protecting care Mr. Snodgrass shortly afterwards confided his own person. Mr. Pickwick accepted the proffered arm of Mr. Tupman, and quietly disappeared, smiling more than ever. And Mr. Wardle, after taking as affectionate a leave of the whole family as if he were ordered for immediate execution, consigned to Mr. Trundle the honor of conveying him upstairs, and retired with a very futile attempt to look impressively solemn and dignified. "What a shocking scene!" said the spinster aunt. "Disgusting!" ejaculated both the young ladies. "Dreadful, dreadful!" said Jingle, looking very grave. He was about a bottle and a half ahead of any of his companions. "Horrid spectacle, very." "What a nice man!" whispered the spinster aunt to Mr. Tupman. "Good-looking, too," observed Emily Wardle. "Oh, decidedly," observed the spinster aunt. Mr. Tupman thought of the widow at Rochester, and his mind was troubled. The succeeding half-hour's conversation was not of a nature to calm his perturbed spirit. The new visitor was very talkative, and the number of his anecdotes was only to be exceeded by the extent of his politeness. Mr. Tupman felt that as Jingle's popularity increased, he, Tupman, retired further into the shade. His laughter was forced, his merriment feigned, and when at last he laid his aching temples between the sheets, he thought, with horrid delight on the satisfaction it would afford him to have Jingle's head at that moment between the feather bed and the mattress. The indefatigable stranger rose betimes next morning, and, although his companions remained in bed, overpowered with the dissipation of the previous night, exerted himself most successfully to promote the hilarity of the breakfast table. So successful were his efforts that even the deaf old lady insisted on having one or two of his best jokes retailed through the trumpet, and even she condescended to observe to the spinster aunt that he, meaning Jingle, was an impudent young fellow, a sentiment in which all her relations then and there present thoroughly coincided. It was the old lady's habit on the fine summer mornings to repair to the arbor in which Mr. Tupman had already signalized himself, in form and manner following. First, the fat boy fetched from a peg behind the old lady's bedroom door a close black satin bonnet, a warm cotton shawl, and a thick stick with a capacious handle, and the old lady, having put on the bonnet and shawl at her leisure, would lean one hand on the stick and the other on the fat boy's shoulder, and walk leisurely to the arbor, where the fat boy would leave her to enjoy the fresh air for the space of half an hour, at the expiration of which time he would return and reconduct her back to the house. The old lady was very precise and very particular, and as this ceremony had been observed for 3 successive summers without the slightest deviation from the accustomed form, she was not a little surprised on this particular morning to see the fat boy, instead of leaving the arbor, walk a few paces out of it, look carefully round him in every direction, and return towards her with a great stealth and air of the most profound mystery. The old lady was timorous. Most old ladies are. And her first impression was that the bloated lad was about to do her some grievous bodily harm with the view of possessing himself of her loose coin. She would have cried for assistance, but age and infirmity had long ago deprived her of the power of screaming. She, therefore, watched his motions with feelings of intense terror, which were in no degree diminished by his coming close up to her and shouting in her ear in an agitated and, as it seemed to her, a threatening tone, "Missus!" Now, it so happened that Mr. Jingle was walking in the garden close to the arbor at this moment. He too heard the shout of "Missus!" and stopped to hear more. There were 3 reasons for his doing so. In the first place, he was idle and curious. Secondly, he was by no means scrupulous. Thirdly, and lastly, he was concealed from view by some flowering shrubs. So there he stood, and there he listened. "Missus!" shouted the fat boy. "Well, Joe," said the trembling old lady, "I am sure I have been very good mistress to you, Joe. You have invariably been treated very kindly. You always never had too much to do, and you have always had enough to eat." This last was an appeal to the fat boy's most sensitive feelings. He seemed touched as he replied emphatically, "I knows I has." "Then what can you want to do now?" said the old lady, gaining courage. "I wants to make your flesh creep," replied the fat boy. This sounded like a very bloodthirsty mode of showing one's gratitude, and, as the old lady did not precisely understand the process by which such a result was to be attained, all her former horrors returned. "What do you think I see in this very arbor last night?" inquired the boy. "Bless us, what?" exclaimed the old lady, alarmed at the solemn manner of the corpulent youth. "The strange gentleman, him as had his arm hurt, a kissing and a hugging—" "Who, Joe? Who? None of the servants, I hope?" "Worser than that," roared the fat boy in the old lady's ear. "Not one of my granddaughters?" "Worser than that." "Worse than that, Joe?" said the old lady, who had thought this the extreme limit of human atrocity. "Who was it, Joe? I insist upon knowing." The fat boy looked cautiously round, and having concluded his survey, shouted in the old lady's ear, "Miss Rachel!" "What?" said the old lady in a shrill tone. "Speak louder." "Miss Rachel!" roared the fat boy. "My daughter?" The train of nods which the fat boy gave by way of assent communicated a blanc mange-like motion to his fat cheeks. "And she suffered him?" exclaimed the old lady. A grin stole over the fat boy's features as he said, "I seen her a kissin' of him again." If Mr. Jingle, from his place of concealment, could have beheld the expression which the old lady's face assumed at this communication, The probability is that a sudden burst of laughter would have betrayed his close vicinity to the summer-house. He listened attentively. Fragments of angry sentences such as, "Without my permission? At her time of life? Miserable old woman like me! Might have waited till I was dead!" and so forth, reached his ears. And then he heard the heels of the fat boy's boots crunching the gravel as he retired and left the old lady alone. It was a remarkable coincidence, perhaps, but it was nevertheless a fact that Mr. Jingle, within 5 minutes after his arrival at Manor Farm on the preceding night, had inwardly resolved to lay siege to the heart of the spinster aunt without delay. He had observation enough to see that his offhand manner was by no means disagreeable to the fair object of his attack, and he had more than a strong suspicion that she possessed that most desirable of all requisites, a small independence. The imperative necessity of ousting his rival by some means or other flashed quickly upon him, and he immediately resolved to adopt certain proceedings tending to that end and object without a moment's delay. Fielding tells us that man is fire and woman tow, and the Prince of Darkness sets a light to him. Mr. Jingle knew that young men, to spinster aunts, are as lighted gas to gunpowder, and he determined to essay the effect of an explosion without loss of time. Full of reflections upon this important decision, he crept from his place of concealment and, under cover of the shrubs before mentioned, approached the house. Fortune seemed determined to favor his design. Mr. Tupman and the rest of the gentlemen left the garden by the side gate just as he obtained a view of it, and the young ladies he knew had walked out alone soon after breakfast. The coast was clear. The breakfast parlor door was partially open. He peeped in. The spinster aunt was knitting. He coughed. She looked up and smiled. Hesitation formed no part of Mr. Alfred Jingle's character. He laid his finger on his lips mysteriously, walked in, and closed the door. "Miss Wardle," said Mr. Jingle, with affected earnestness, "forgive intrusion. Short acquaintance. No time for ceremony. All discovered." "Sir?" said the spinster aunt, rather astonished by the unexpected apparition, and somewhat doubtful of Mr. Jingle's sanity. "Hush!" said Mr. Jingle in a stage whisper. "Large boy, dumpling face, round eyes, rascal." Here he shook his head expressively, and the spinster aunt trembled with agitation. "I presume you allude to Joseph, sir?" said the lady, making an effort to appear composed. "Yes, ma'am. Damn that Joe. Treacherous dog, Joe. Told the old lady furious, wild, raving, Arbor, Tupman, kissing and hugging, all that sort of thing. Eh, ma'am, eh?" "Mr. Jingle," said the spinster aunt. "If you come here, sir, to insult me—" "Not at all, by no means," replied the unabashed Mr. Jingle. "Overheard the tale. Came to warn you of your danger. Tender my services. Prevent the hubbub. Never mind. Think it an insult. Leave the room." And he turned, as if to carry the threat into execution. "What shall I do?" said the poor spinster, bursting into tears. "My brother will be furious." "Of course he will," said Mr. Jingle, pausing. "Outrageous." "Oh, Mr. Jingle, what can I say?" exclaimed the spinster aunt, in another flood of despair. "Say he dreamt it," replied Mr. Jingle, coolly. A ray of comfort darted across the mind of the spinster aunt at this suggestion. Mr. Jingle perceived it, and followed up his advantage. "Pooh-pooh, nothing more easy. Blackguard boy, lovely woman, fat boy horsewhipped. You believed, end of the matter, all comfortable." Whether the probability of escaping from the consequences of this ill-timed discovery was delightful to the spinster's feelings, or whether the hearing herself described as a lovely woman softened the asperity of her grief, we know not. She blushed slightly, and cast a grateful look on Mr. Jingle. That insinuating gentleman sighed deeply, fixed his eyes on the spinster aunt's face for a couple of minutes, started melodramatically, and suddenly withdrew them. "You seem unhappy, Mr. Jingle," said the lady, in a plaintive voice. "May I show my gratitude for your kind interference by inquiring into the cause, with a view, if possible, to its removal?" "Ha!" exclaimed Mr. Jingle, with another start. "Removal! Remove my unhappiness, and your love bestowed upon a man who is insensible to the blessing, who even now contemplates a design upon the affections of the niece of the creature who— But no, he is my friend. I will not expose his vices. Miss Wardle, farewell." At the conclusion of this address, the most consecutive he was ever known to utter, Mr. Jingle applied to his eyes the remnant of a handkerchief before noticed, and turned towards the door. "Stay, Mr. Jingle," said the spinster aunt emphatically. "You have made an allusion to Mr. Tupman. Explain it." "Never!" exclaimed Jingle, with a professional, i.e., theatrical air. "Never!" And, By way of showing that he had no desire to be questioned further, he drew a chair close to that of the spinster aunt and sat down. "Mr. Jingle," said the aunt, "I entreat, I implore you, if there is any dreadful mystery connected with Mr. Tupman, reveal it." "Can I," said Mr. Jingle, fixing his eyes on the aunt's face, "can I see, lovely creature, sacrificed at the shrine, heartless avarice?" He appeared to be struggling with various conflicting emotions for a few seconds, and then said in a low, deep voice, "Tupman only wants your money." "The wretch!" exclaimed the spinster, with energetic indignation. Mr. Jingle's doubts were resolved. She had money. "More than that," said Jingle. "Loves another." "Another?" ejaculated the spinster. "Who?" "Short girl, black eyes, niece Emily." There was a pause. Now, if there were one individual in the whole world of whom the spinster aunt entertained a mortal and deeply rooted jealousy, it was this identical niece. The color rushed over her face and neck, and she tossed her head in silence with an air of ineffable contempt. At last, biting her thin lips and bridling up, she said, "It can't be. I won't believe it." "Watch him," said Jingle. "I will," said the aunt. "Watch his looks." "I will." "His whispers." "I will." "He'll sit next to her at table." "Let him." "He'll flatter her." "Let him." "He'll pay her every possible attention." "Let him." "And he'll cut you." "Cut me!" screamed the spinster aunt. "He cut me! Will he?" And she trembled with rage and disappointment. "Will you convince yourself?" said Jingle. "I will." "You'll show him your spirit?" "I will." "You'll not have him afterwards?" "Never." "You'll take somebody else?" "Yes." "You shall." Mr. Jingle fell on his knees, remained thereupon for 5 minutes thereafter, and rose the accepted lover of the spinster aunt, conditionally upon Tupman's perjury being made clear and manifest. The burden of proof lay with Mr. Alfred Jingle, and he produced his evidence that very day at dinner. The spinster aunt could hardly believe her eyes. Mr. Tracy Tupman was established at Emily's side, ogling, whispering, and smiling in opposition to Mr. Snodgrass. Not a word, not a look, not a glance did he bestow upon his heart's pride of the evening before. "Damn that boy," thought old Mr. Wardle to himself. He had heard the story from his mother. "Damn that boy, he must have been asleep. It's all imagination." "Traitor," thought the spinster aunt to herself. "Dear Mr. Jingle was not deceiving me. Oh, how I hate the wretch." The following conversation may serve to explain to our readers this apparently unaccountable alteration of deportment on the part of Tracy Tupman. The time was evening. The scene, the garden. There were two figures walking in a side path. One was rather short and stout, the other rather tall and slim. They were Mr. Tupman and Mr. Jingle. The stout figure commenced the dialogue. "How did I do it?" he inquired. "Splendid, capital, couldn't act better myself. You must repeat the part tomorrow, every evening, till further notice." "Does Rachel still wish it?" "Of course. She doesn't like it, but must be done. Averts suspicion. Afraid of her brother. Says there's no help for it. Only a few days more. When old folks blinded. Crown your happiness." "Any message?" "Love, best love, kindest regards, unalterable affection. Can I say anything for you?" "My dear fellow," replied the unsuspicious Mr. Tupman, fervently grasping his friend's hand, "carry my best love. Say how hard I find it to dissemble. Say anything that's kind, but add how sensible I am of the necessity of suggestion she made to me, through you, this morning. Say I applaud her wisdom and admire her discretion." "I will. Anything more?" "Nothing. Only add how ardently I long for the time when I may call her mine, and all dissimulation may be unnecessary." "Certainly, certainly. Anything more?" "Oh, my friend," said poor Mr. Tupman, again grasping the hand of his companion, "receive my warmest thanks for your disinterested kindness, and forgive me if I have ever, even in thought, done you the injustice of supposing that you could stand in my way. My dear friend, can I ever repay you?" "Don't talk of it," replied Mr. Jingle. He stopped short, as if suddenly recollecting something, and said, "By the by, you can't spare £10, can you? Very particular purpose. Pay you in 3 days." "I dare say I can," replied Mr. Tupman, in the fullness of his heart. 3 days, you say?" "Only 3 days. All over then. No more difficulties." Mr. Tupman counted the money into his companion's hand, and he dropped it piece by piece into his pocket as they walked towards the house. "Be careful," said Mr. Jingle. "Not a look." "Not a wink," said Mr. Tupman. "Not a syllable." "Not a whisper." "All your attentions to the niece. Rather rude than otherwise to the aunt. Only way of deceiving the old ones. I'll take care, said Mr. Tupman aloud. And I'll take care, said Mr. Jingle internally, and they entered the house. The scene of that afternoon was repeated that evening, and on the 3 afternoons and evenings next ensuing. On the 4th, the host was in high spirits, for he had satisfied himself that there was no ground for the charge against Mr. Tupman. So was Mr. Tupman, for Mr. Jingle had told him that his affair would soon be brought to a crisis. So was Mr. Pickwick, for he was seldom otherwise. So was not Mr. Snodgrass, for he had grown jealous of Mr. Tupman. So was the old lady, for she had been waning at whist. So were Mr. Jingle and Miss Wardle, for reasons of sufficient importance in this eventful history to be narrated in another chapter.